We have this service. Now we can go ahead and use it in our component. So let's go to the component.ts, which is this file. The first thing I want to do is to define a variable that's going to hold all of our employees whenever we get them back. So I'm going to do public, and this is public because it's going to be used in the HTML file, and by default it's public, so you don't necessarily have to say public. I'm just coming from a strongly typed language, so I like to put all my access modifier, but you don't necessarily have to do this. So I'm going to call this employees because it's going to hold all of the employees coming from the backend, and I'm going to give it a type of employee array. And I do this by passing in those brackets here, and I need to import employee, and that's coming from our class. Now I can go down below and create another function that I can use to call our service. So to do this, we're going to need to inject this service in this class as well, the same way that we did inject the HTTP client, as you can see here, inside of this class. I'm just going to go ahead and copy this and go back here, and in the constructor, I'm going to put a new line. I'm going to call in the employee service. So I'm going to call it employee service, and that's going to be of type employee service. And of course, we need to import that from our service. So make sure you import employee service from wherever your service is. So now we have access to the service because we just injected it into this app component. So what we can do, we can create another function. So I'm going to do public. I'm going to call it get employees. And it's not going to accept any parameters, and it's going to return void. And what I want to do inside of this function is to call our service. So I can do this employee service that get employees. And since this is an observable, so it's going to make a request over the internet or over the network, and this is going to take some time. That's why it's returning an observable. So we need to subscribe to that observable. So after we call the function, we have to call subscribe so that we can be notified whenever some data comes back from the server. Either that could be the actual employees that we requested or some kind of an error. And here I'm just going to specify our response. So I'm going to say if we get a response back, which is going to be of type employee array, because that's what it's going to be, then we're going to execute some piece of code here. And what we want to do is to set this variable that we define up top to be equal to the body of the request, because by default, using an observable, it's just going to give you whatever response is coming back inside of that body of the response. So we can set this equal to response, which is going to be the list or array of all of our employees. Otherwise, which in this case of an error, we also have to handle that. So in case we get an error, which is going to be of type HTTP error, and we have to import that. So in case it's an HTTP error response, what we want to do is execute a different piece of code. In that case, I can just send an alert or just console log it to the console, and I can just console that error message. So I can just access the error object, and then there's a message that I can access here. So we can just see it as an alert. So now we can see that this component will have all the employees in it whenever we call this function. So we can use this variable inside of the template, because as you can see, it is the template for this specific component, which means it's communicating directly with this component. So we can access this variable inside of this HTML file. So we need to be able to call this function whenever this component is loaded or whenever it's initialized. And one way we can do this is to just implement an interface called onInit. So I'm going to do implement, it's called onInit. And then once we implement onInit, which is coming from Angular core, then we need to override a function called ng-onInit. So I'm going to go right below the constructor, and I'm going to do ng-onInit, and it doesn't take any parameters. And all I have to do now is to call our function inside of this ng-onInit, because it's going to run whenever this component is initialized. So I can do this, get employees, and that's just the name of our function down below. So now whenever this component is initialized, it's going to call this function, and this function in turn is going to call our function that we just defined down here, and then it's going to set our employees whenever we get the response back from the server. And if we get an error, then we're just going to send an alert to show that error to the user. So now I can go into the component where we have all of our HTML, and we don't need all this stuff. This is just the default that came with Angular. And all I want to do now is to just define some div. So I'm going to do div, and inside of this div, I can just use ng4 so that I can loop on all of the actual employees that I'm getting from the backend. So I can just do ng4 and then set this equal to let employee, which is going to be a local variable of employees, which is the variable coming from the actual component. So then it's going to loop over every single one of those employees and save each one of them in a variable called employee. So inside that div, then I can go ahead and create another div. And then let's say I want to display the name of the employee. So I can do string interpolation, and then I can access the local variable employee, and then I can do .name. As you can see, I have IntelliSense because I defined the type as an interface in the application. So I can access the name of the employee. So we can do just that for now, just so we can see the name of the employee. And to close this and remove this div here, and remove this extra. So that's very simple. I just want to show you guys what we get back from the actual server. And there's one last thing to do is to just go back. You can see the employee service. We have to specify the actual URL, which is localhost 8080. So the way I want to do this is to go into the environment folder. And inside of the environment folder, we have two files here. There's one environment configuration file for production and one for development. So we're going to put this in our development because right now we're on localhost. So we're using the one for development. As you can see, production is false on this one. For production, you can see production is true here. So we're not using this because we're not going into production yet, but we're going to use the one for development. So I'm going to go back into the environment for development. And then here, I'm just going to pass in a new attribute to this, and it's gonna be just API base URL. You can just give this any name you want. I'm gonna set this equal to our URL, which is http://localhost, and that's 8080. And this is the URL for the server for our backend. So now we can access this URL using our variable. So let's go back into the employee service. So here, instead of empty string, we can just call the environment, which is down here. And then we can just access the API-based URL. So Visual Studio Code is importing everything for me, but you really have to make sure that you're importing everything, and you have to make sure that all the packages are coming from the right place, like HTTP clients coming from HTTP, from Angular coming to HTTP, and observables coming from RxJS. So now we have access to our base URL here. And one last thing we have to do to configure the service is to let the entire Angular application app know about the service. So we're doing this here by injecting it here and then saying provided in root, which is the root component of our app. In that case, that would be this component right here, this module. So if we don't have this, then we have to register this service as a provider in here. So you would go here and then say employee service like this. Okay, so you either do it like this just by saying provided in root, or you just do it manually in here like this. So now our service is configured and the entire Angular application is aware of it, and we can go ahead and give this a try.